Good morning. I hope everyone is well. Good afternoon to my guest, Charles Coulombe, Catholic historian. Just let me introduce him. He's written about 15 books. Most recently, a biography of Karl of Austria. He's currently working on a sequel. He contributed an essay to a book called In Defense of Monarchy and Ultramontanism and Tradition. And yeah, he has a podcast called Off the Menu. You can access and yeah, Charles, how are you today from the great Catholic nation of Austria?
Well, I'm fine. It's always great. Always here in paradise. It's wonderful. It's not Alberta, but few places are.
Yes, that's very true.
And they both begin with and end with A.
Oh, that is true. Austria, Alberta, yeah, Australia as well, I guess.
That's right. We just had Anzac Day, so
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I don't think I've seen a picture of. I don't think a picture of you exists online where you're not dressed in like exemplar. Like you got a nice suit on. You're always rocking the.
We can blame my father. I inherited his fashion sense.
Ah,
The
wow.
and I suppose also you might say it's a bit of a rebellion against the spirit of the '60s. Uh, because when I was little, and I was once, hard to believe, but it's true. Uh, in the first 5 or 6 years of the 1960s, my earliest memories, in other words, the world looked like Mad Men and Perry Mason, and then seemingly overnight, it went crazy. And even as a boy, I didn't care for it.
Interesting. No, that's good. No, that's good. There's definitely a loss of the sense of dress. Like if you I don't know if you saw the movie that came out this summer, Oppenheimer, but I don't think I've seen more suits in my life in a movie.
Well, believe it or not, it was like that in real life. People wore suits. I mean, I can remember my parents, my mother putting on a cocktail dress, and my dad putting on black tie to go to dinner at people's houses. You know, it was just the way it was.
Wow, like now that's the thing you do for like a wedding or something.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it was what you wore to go out, and I mean, people. Again, this is beyond my memory. I can remember my parents talking about it, but to enjoy themselves, they go out for dinner and dancing. You know, to this
Wow.
day, in our great American Midwest, we still have the old supper clubs, and a few of them still have the tradition of steak, seafood, and cocktails on the one hand, and live music for dancing on the other.
I got to go to one of those in the Midwest, you say.
Yeah, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, places like that, Iowa. The supper clubs.
Supper clubs. I got to write that down. Supper clubs. Yeah.
You may even have them in Ontario, for all I know.
Okay. Um okay, so our topic today is Charles the First and Cromwell. And since I'm Canadian, my guest Charles is American. A lot of my viewers are Canadian and American and English and Australian. I got a Australian guy who tunes into the live stream often. So this is a very important topic. But before we get there, I want to just ask two intro questions. One is how you came to know the Lord Jesus Christ and end up in the church you're in this case, the Catholic Church.
Well, I don't know a time when I wasn't Catholic. Uh, I suppose before my baptism I wasn't, but I don't remember that, so I can't comment about it. Uh, the Our Lord was always a part of my family life. We said grace at dinner, and we were regular mass goers. We prayed as a family. Uh, both my parents, my father in particular, were very devout. And of course, my first communion was one of the biggest events of my life, directly approaching Christ himself in the Mass. Uh, I remember the year or two before, I was getting increasingly excited as the great day would come closer and closer, and then it finally happened. Of course, all during this time and all during my growing up, it was the post-Vatican II era, and the Catholic Church was sort of self-immolating on the altar of crazy, and I got to see all of that up close and personal. But fortunately for me, I had a father who was very much aware of the difference between the office and the man, and that if you can't maintain that division in your head, uh, and I don't care if you're Catholic or some other denomination, if you can't maintain the division between the man and the office, then every failing of a man who attempts to serve God will be seen as a reflection on that God himself. And yeah, I can say that I never really had any doubts, actually, growing up. I won't say I was always I can't say I was always a moral paragon, but I knew I was wrong. I can remember back when I was in comedy, and various of my friends would say, "Well, I don't know why you bother going to confession. You're no better than we are." I'd say, "I know that. The difference is
That's
I
why
don't
you
pretend
yeah.
I'm right.
Yeah.
Well, I don't pretend I'm right, you know." And fortunately, as I got older, I began to make more of a serious attempt to live what I preached, as it were. And how well I've succeeded at that, we'll find out at my judgment. I, people ask me, "Are you a good Catholic?" I say, "No, I'm practicing. I hope to get it right someday." Uh,
Oh, I might borrow
but
that one.
feel free. It's certainly not what's the word? It's certainly not copyrighted. But I've always been aware of God's movement in my life, not through voices and visions, but simply through doors opening and closing. When it's time to do one thing, everything pushes me into it. When it's time to do something else, well, poof, off I went. Drove my brother crazy, I can tell you. He's the king of the 5-year plans. But it's just been the way it is. So to sum up, I really can't tell you of a time when I didn't know Christ.
Okay. Oh, wonderful.
I but I can say I've gotten to know him better and better and better the older I've gotten.
Yeah, faith develops with age, and oh no, that's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, no, so I guess you're like me. It's like cradle Catholic. Um ha, have always been Catholic. You might have had ups and downs, but like I've always been with Christ attending mass as well. So I guess we're similar in that regard. What got you interested in history and becoming a historian?
Well, I became an historian. I'll answer it in reverse order. I became an historian just by flopping into it, really, more than anything else. What interested me in history was my father, my family, because we came from somewhere. You know, we I was very much aware from an early age that and by we I mean my family, my brother, my sister and Evelyn, my brother, my father, and my mother, that the four of us were the product of a particular set of historical circumstances. Had they acted out in a different fashion, none of this would have existed. You know, had Wolfe not won at the Plains of Abraham, the likelihood of my being in existence is unlikely. Same as if Cornwallis had won at Yorktown. It was funny. Or if another strand of my French blood was Scots. I had a multiple great grandfather who fought at Culloden, and of course had the Jacobites won. He would never have gone to Canada in 1772. So I was very much aware from an early age that the history of the past is what made us and me who we are. And then, of course, that's true of everything. What people forget, you hear people say, "Oh, well, history is boring" and all that. Well, it's only boring because it's made that way by bad teachers.
Mm-hmm.
The truth
Yep.
is, history, I'll tell you what history is. History is the movement of God's will through time against the background of millions of free and fallen wills. And that's what history is. And to me, it's endlessly fascinating. You can't understand where you are unless you know where you were. And so, of course, without that, you can't know where you're going either. I've had people say to me at different occasions for different reasons, "Oh, you're so prophetic. How did you know that was going to happen?" Well, I didn't, if you mean like fortune telling. But if you know a good deal of history and if you know a bit of human nature, and believe me, the one will teach you the other and vice versa. Knowledge of human nature will illumine history. Knowledge of history will show you human nature. If you have that, you would be amazed at how clear the present can become to you and how easy it is to figure out what certain sorts of people will do in certain sorts of situations, simply because most of them do the same thing most of the time. It's the exceptions that are really good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I like the way you put that. Like a very historically minded answer. Um, so our topic today, let's just get right into this. Our topic today is Charles the First and Cromwell, basically the English Civil War and that stuff. So, yeah, I will let you. I'll let you take it away. Take as much time as you need. I might pepper in with a question if something seems a bit off, but um, it's all yours.
Well, all right. Well, firstly, it's interesting that in recent years, most changes in scholarship I have problems with, but every now and then something comes along that's really, really good. And in what were formerly called the English Civil Wars, they have today a much better phrase for them: the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. And I love that. It sounds like something out of Tolkien. It really does.
Yeah, it sounds
But
like Game of Thrones.
yeah, well, that too. But what it reflects is the fact that you had three kingdoms, England, Scotland, and Ireland, with three different sets of issues going on. One king and one major opponent. And the conflict between them took on a different face in each of the three kingdoms and in the New World, because, of course, it was also fought in the colonies. We don't realize that, but it's kind of ironic. The last battle of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms was Severn Creek in Maryland in 1652, and the last battle of the American Revolution was fought in India in 1783. So these things are always a bit more complex than people like to give them credit for. But another way to understand these wars before we jump into them is to bear in mind that they were part of a series of conflicts, starting with the Protestant Reformation, so called, and ending perhaps with what I would call the Second American Civil War in 1865. There's a wonderful book called, by a man named Kevin Phillips, called The Cousins' Wars. And I really recommend it very, very highly, because these conflicts were sort of linked with each other, and they transformed ultimately the whole of the Anglosphere from a little kingdom on the remote edge of Europe to a vast two-headed colossus standing across the globe, i.e. the British Empire and the United States of America. Now, what makes I'll talk a little bit about the Reformation roots of the conflict we're looking at, but one of the things that makes it so important is that the party system, as we think of it, in a sense, emerged from it. But its ultimate outcome is why the Anglosphere is liberal in the sense of Whig to its very bones. Or to put this another way, we were discussing this earlier, what we call liberal in America, the European and Latin American conservatives would call socialist. What we call conservative, they would call liberal. And what they would call conservative, that is to say, opponents of the ideas of the French Revolution, which in time would spread throughout the continent of Latin America, we don't have, because those ideals were already institutionalized, in a sense, in all of the Anglosphere to a degree, and particularly in the United States. So let's pull back now to the separation of Rome, with Rome, of Elizabeth I, because in a sense, that's where the story really starts. Every civil dispute feeds into the one that follows. So one of the things about the Protestant revolt and Henry VIII's break with Rome is that it was partly affected by the War of the Roses that had come before. And I mean this not ideologically, because both the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, the red and white rose people, they had the same religion, and really they believed the same things politically. It was just a question of who was the right king. But the nature of the crown that he would occupy and the faith that he and everyone else would hold, both sides agreed on completely. There was no issue there. Ideology, as we know it, did not exist. Not in the sense of overthrowing the altar, the throne, local liberties, and the scheme of the estates, of everybody having a place in the national family. Everybody held those things. They differed in concrete applications, which is why you'd have the Guelph and Ghibellines in Germany and Italy, the Armagnacs and Burgundians in France, and so on. But these disputes were not actually ideological. They were practical. But with the Protestant revolt and with a number of secular princes adopting Protestantism, you had the beginnings of ideology in the West, in the Christian world. And that led to some very bloody wars in Germany and France, and of course the British Isles. Interestingly enough, prior to the history of Ireland, I noticed we've got a lot of Irish viewers right now, so I'm going to take a little bit out to say something about Ireland. For one thing, it's a beautiful country. I was just there. I love Ireland, so I've got a lot of Irish blood, believe it or not. But most French Canadians have some. It's hard to escape. But the thing is that Ireland was in a state of civil war in the 1100s, which is why it was basically given over to Henry II to civilize and calm down. That led to initially to a lot of fighting between the Normans and the Irish, the Gaelic Irish. But then a funny thing happened. Things settled down, and the Irish assimilated the Normans. And that's why, to this day, people with last names like Fitzgerald and Fitzhugh and Fitzroy are all Norman descendants, but they're as Irish as anybody with O'Neill or O'Donnell or O'Sullivan. So Oh, where am I going with all this? Well, that changed when Henry VIII became Protestant and he attempted to impose Protestantism on the Irish, which we did the same in England. In Scotland, of course, there was already a big fight between the King's party and a faction of the nobility, and this would end up becoming religious in nature. When Ireland was when the Irish were defeated in the so-called 9 Years' War, led to the flight of the Earls in 1609. By that time, Henry's daughter Elizabeth I had died, and herein you come into a very, very, very strange accident of history. You've heard of Mary, Queen of Scots, I presume.
Yep.
Well, her mother was a Tudor and the sister of Henry VIII. And so she was the closest heir that Elizabeth I had. That was why Elizabeth considered her a danger. And when she lost the Scottish Civil War between the Catholics and the Protestants and fled into England, Elizabeth put her under house arrest and eventually had her executed. However, her infant son, whom she'd had to leave behind and was raised as a Protestant, James VI, and first of England as it would become, he became Elizabeth's heir. And so the House of Stuart assumed control of both Scotland and England. And then he inherited the Irish fight with the English. They were finally defeated. We had the flight of the Earls in 1608. But to try to, how do I put it, pacify the area, and also to avoid having too much trouble with them, he moved a lot of the hardest-nosed Scots Presbyterians to Ulster, and that was the beginning of the Ulster Scots. So now you've got James the sixth and first of England and Ireland, sixth of Scotland, who's king, who has very little opposition initially.
And just for a historical note, this is like you've heard of the King James Bible, right? You know, for all the guys watching, this is the same king as that.
He's the king. He's the king of the Mayflower Compact. He's the king of the King James Bible, about which the funniest thing I ever heard was, well, if the King James Bible is good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for me. And
I've heard that one too.
I never have a response for it. I have no answer to that. It's on a par with it's hereditary in my family to have no children. you know, okay, I guess. At any rate, their things were under James. Now, Henry VIII did something else interesting. As you remember, when he broke with Rome, he seized all of the monasteries.
Yep.
Well, he didn't keep them. Most of them he gave away to various friends. And this began the creation of an oligarchical class of landowners who would soon have the majority of the wealth and so the power in England. It's interesting that the man who helped the king really as this major right-hand man in destroying the monasteries was a man named Thomas Cromwell.
Yep.
And Thomas Cromwell, eventually they fell out and he was executed, but his great-nephew was a man named Oliver Cromwell. Now, one of the things about Calvinism is that it encourages very much the making of money. Well, why does it do that? Well, Calvin was of the opinion in what was called radical predestination. And by the way, everything I'm going to say, wild oversimplification. I'm talking about the way it gets received popularly. So if there are any deep reformed theologians out there who are going to catch me on being overly simple, I know that. I also know that it's not quite as black and white as it appears to a theologian. But to normal people, I think I'm going to be giving it pretty much the truth. So here's the thing. Imagine a setup where you have no control of your own salvation. You're predestined to heaven or hell, God's good pleasure. But while you can't know if you're among the saved, surely God will shower his elect with blessings in this life. So if you're doing well financially, etc., that's a sign of predestination to heaven. And so to reassure yourself and your neighbors that you're among the elect, working hard and making a lot of money becomes a religious obligation. And that
sounds like the prosperity gospel.
Well, it is. That's where the prosperity gospel comes from. We all, in origin, we call it the Puritan work ethic. Also the Protestant work ethic. But the prosperity gospel, I mean, it's interesting. Who were two of the major prosperity gospelers of the late 20th century? Norman Vincent Peale in New York and the Reverend Robert Schuller in the LA area, Orange County. What did these two men have in common? They were both Dutch Reformed. Now, the Reformed Church in America is no longer explicitly Calvinist in the sense of holding to radical predestination, but the attitudes remain. And this sort of one of the things that the United States received with its Puritan settlers is a sort of secularized Calvinism, a feeling of being the chosen people, of being a people set apart. And this you'll find, by the way, not just with the Americans, but with the Ulster Scots, the Afrikaners. They very much identified radically with the people of Israel in the Old Testament. And they looked at their history that way. So in other words, they're the chosen people. All right. Mm-hmm. But they're dwelling in bondage. The Ulster Scots in Scotland, the Afrikaners in the Cape, the Puritans in England. They leave the Exodus, crossing the ocean for us, the Ulster Plantation for the Ulster Scots, the Great Trek for the Boers, the Afrikaners. Of course, when they arrive, a whole lot of Canaanites. Well, the French and the Spanish and the Indians for us, the various African tribes for the Afrikaners, and the Native Irish for the Ulster Scots. So that, with the American, the explicitly religious basis of that drained out. But what was left was a sort of residue of what you could call American exceptionalism, the vague notion that somehow we are the chosen people, the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of mankind. And that, incidentally, thanks to the American Revolution, is something that differentiates us from the rest of the Anglosphere. Whatever issues the rest of you have going on, that's not one of them. But unfortunately, in recent years, that's kind of flipped. The way Calvinism often flips into Unitarianism, it's flipped into wokery. From being the last best hope of mankind, the shining city on the hill, we become the most horrible nation that ever was, born in genocide and built in slavery. Now, of course, neither of these are exactly true. They're not entirely false, either of them, but they're certainly not exactly true. And one of them is a more self-hating narrative than the other. I'll leave it to you to decide which that was. But at any rate, going back then to all of this going on when James was on the throne, you have the Puritans becoming more and more powerful under him, but still the pretense of loyalty. If you read the Mayflower Compact, by which the Pilgrims constituted themselves as a body in Plymouth Plantation, they talk about serving their dread sovereign lord, the king. It's very, very poetic, the Mayflower Compact. But things were coming to a head. Now, one of the other issues that were beginning in James's time would carry over into the next reign was the question of the enclosures. And this was an extremely important issue. Most of England was divided up into manors, which were basically settlements around a manor house and church. You might have a single manor owned by a squire. You might have a great nobleman with hundreds of manors and with sort of managers in each of the manor houses he didn't live in. But whatever the case might be, the rest of the land was divided up into farms that were farmed by tenants. And said tenants were allowed to graze their animals, which were essential to their existence. Remember, this is mostly subsistence farming. They have to pay rents, but for the most part, people eat what they grow and they grow what they eat. And they make what they wear and they wear what they make. So the enclosures, the so-called common lands, were lands that all of the tenants of a given manor could graze their animals on. Legally, they belonged to the lord of the manor. Practically, they were used by everybody. Now, the enclosures meant that the lord of the manor, whether he be, as I say, he's only got the one, or he's a great nobleman with hundreds of these things scattered around the country, or concentrated in 2 or 3 areas, whatever it might be, he would assert his right to the common land and enclose it, possibly put sheep to graze on it. And this grazing, in the end would contribute to the rise of the wool industry. At any rate, the thing was that by enclosing the land like that, it meant that his tenants had nowhere to graze their animals. And so it had the practical effect of driving some or all of them off the land, where they would end up having to go either to the New World or become part of the city mob. And that, in a couple of generations, would end up becoming the workforce for the Industrial Revolution. So you see, these things are not unconnected. Even as the wool, the ever-increasing supply of wool, increased English industry, as it, before it became industrial. The weaving of sheep's wool became a very, very big business as early as the 16th century, and the enclosures fed it constantly. So, you're the local squire. You've got this land. You've got these people on it. They pay you rent, but sheep are a lot more profitable. Now, oddly enough, here's where Puritanism became a very helpful notion. You might be disposed not to get rid of your tenants purely for religion's sake. The poor you'll always have with you. But what if you had a faith whereby, simply by virtue of being lord of the manor, you obviously were among the saved, and your tenants, well, obviously they're not among the saved. Not at all. So, long and the short of it is that the enclosures spread through England under the last few days of James. Puritanism spread through England, and of course, this how do I put it? This oligarchy that grew up eventually controlled the lower house of Parliament, and the pro-enclosure lords were a heavy feature of the House of Lords. All right, there we are when James the Sixth and First dies. He is replaced with his son, King Charles the First. Charles the First is a very interesting man. James, although a stout Protestant, married a lady named Anne of Denmark, and she was a Danish princess, hence her name, but she converted to Catholicism, and she had a big influence on her son. Now, Charles was very much a Catholicizer in Anglican terms, And here again, there are several things we have to remember. One is that although we know in 2020 hindsight, thanks to Leo XIII, that Anglican orders are invalid, that ruling had not been made in the 17th century. So Catholics were not sure whether or not Anglican orders were valid. And you'll see that Rome's dealings with the Church of England were very different to what they would be later. Secondly, Charles married a French princess, a Catholic, Henriette Marie, who was extremely devout, who outraged some of the popular opinion because she she went to Tyburn, where so many of the Catholic martyrs had been murdered, Tyburn Hill, and venerated the spot as a site of martyrdom. Now, you can guess, since this had happened very, very recently, it didn't please people. Moreover, he inherited from his father a number, bearing in mind that being a Catholic priest was illegal. He had inherited from his father in the London jails, I think 7 or 8 Catholic priests who were in jail as Catholic priests. What he did was he allowed them to leave during the day to minister to their flocks in London and to go back into the jail at night. And this, too, you can imagine, didn't really make a lot of unhappiness there. Mind you, he did a number of other things as well. He appointed an Archbishop of Canterbury named Laud, who was very much a Catholicizer like the king. You have a whole set of theologians of his era called the Caroline Divines. And to this day, the High Church or Anglo-Catholic element of the Anglican Communion look to these fellows as their forebears. The real issue, of course, was that Laud believed that the Church of England was of apostolic origin, apostolic succession. Basically, he believed it was the Catholic Church in England that was in schism with Rome. Whereas, of course, the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, hence the name, of any Romish influences. Now, you can guess what side the king was on by the fact that he and his wife jointly prayed to the saints and the Blessed Virgin. And later on, when he was in prison, Charles would make a vow, kind of like Louis XVI, that if he regained his throne, he would return the abbeys to the church that the crown had, like Westminster Abbey and so on.
Wow.
And he negotiated for reunion with Rome, and that didn't go down very well with certain elements. Well, he called Parliament in session when he first became king. And they gave him a hard time over a lot of things. So he said, you know what, gentlemen, I don't need you. Bye-bye. So he dissolved Parliament. And for the next 10 years or so, he ruled without them. The King's Peace. And it was a very quiet and a very pleasant period, you might say, in English history, and Scottish and Irish history. It was quiet. And the king basically paid for the government out of his own estates. But he was interested in not just Catholicizing the church in England, but also the church in Scotland, which was Calvinist and Presbyterian, but it had bishops imposed on it by his father. He decided they needed a new liturgy that was more Catholic, i.e. more Anglican in nature. And so he imposed in 1631, I think, the new book, the King's Book. The result were widespread riots that turned into civil war in Scotland, and the beginning of what was called the Scottish War. Well, the king could not fight a war on peacetime subsidies, so he had to call Parliament back into session. He did. and Parliament wanted all sorts of power from him. He refused to give it, dissolved Parliament again, and that was the so-called short Parliament. He tried for another election. He got a lot of the same people back, and that was the beginning of the long Parliament. Initially, they seized power. They forced the king to deliver to them for trial both Archbishop Laud and his deputy in Ireland, Charles was not Laud's, Strafford. And he had to sign their death warrants, which broke his heart. Strafford told him, better my head than yours, Your Majesty. Go ahead and sign it. But he felt guilty about it at the end of his days. In Scotland, Laud's case, another point that should be made is that twice the Holy See offered him the red hat to make him a cardinal.
Wow.
And this is why I mention that the division between Rome and England was not as clear then as it is today. And he laughingly refused both times. But the funny thing about that is that, of course, the offer could not have been made without Charles I's knowledge and permission. He couldn't force Laud to take it, but he could certainly give the papal nuncio the authorization to offer. And
wow,
I think it's fair to say that he would have been happier if Laud had taken it, but he didn't. And of course, bearing in mind what happened later, in all likelihood, things might have gotten a lot harder for him, for Laud, had he accepted the red hat. Though he was executed, so it's hard to say how it could have gotten much worse. Anyway, that was in 1641. Well, the Parliament is trying to usurp more and more power. They rush through an Enclosures Act. All those priests that had been imprisoned in London, they had executed. Oh. And this is one of the interesting things. You often hear people talk about the Catholic priests executed under Charles I. Well, they were executed by the Long Parliament. And seeing that he couldn't save Laud or Strafford, it's highly unlikely he could have saved any Catholic priests.
Mm.
So you really can't put that to the king's charge. However, things got worse and worse. He attempted to arrest some of the more obnoxious members of the House of Commons, and they fled. So he realized that Parliament was in control in London, so he withdrew. And at Nottingham in 1642, raised his standard and called all loyal men to stand by him. And that was the beginning of the wars. Now, without wanting to analyze them in any great detail, what we can do is have a look at who backed whom, at who was on whose side. Where I mentioned the Puritans. Well, the so-called home counties, East Anglia, Kent, places like that, were primarily pro-Parliament. Royalist strength in England was primarily in the north and the west. Cornwall, Somerset, Yorkshire, and Lancashire. In other words, the remoter areas. Now, mind you, there were islands and pockets of Royalist feeling in Roundhead areas and Roundhead feeling in Royalist areas. But by and large, that's a fairly good way to look at it. Catholics and high Anglicans tended to back the king. In fact, the Catholics all backed the king. Parliament was backed by, again, Puritans, Calvinists, etc. Wales was almost all Royalist, and at the time still heavily Catholic. Scotland divided again along the same lines they had divided under Mary, Queen of Scots. So the Highlands, the Islands, all the Catholic and Anglican areas were for the king. And his great paladin, if you will, in Scotland was a man called the Earl of Montrose, who was a Presbyterian himself, had a primarily Anglican officer corps, and the rank and file of his army were mostly Catholic. And there's a famous story. They entered a cathedral town in Scotland, and for the first time since the Protestant revolt, a mass was offered for the majority of the army, who were Catholic, Irish, or Scots. In a side chapel, the Anglican officers gathered and had a Book of Common Prayer service among themselves. And then Montrose himself was in a little alcove with the Presbyterian minister having the Bible read to him. So that was their Sunday.
Wow.
Yeah, it was very interfaith. But Montrose was killed. He's in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh today. And then in Ireland, what happened in 1641, the native Irish in Ulster, and then later throughout the island, saw the fight between the king and parliament as an opportunity to free themselves. So that began a very unpleasant period, the 1641 revolt in Ireland, where Catholics and Protestants went after each other, no quarter asked and none given. It was one of the worst civil wars ever, and is burned into the memory of both the Ulster Scots and the Irish. Eventually, however, except for the Ulster Scots, the other sides, the Anglicans, the old English Catholics, the Gaelic chiefs, they all united behind the king. It was what was called the Confederation of Kilkenny. So you basically have the most interesting characters backing the king. And of course, there's a whole bunch of poets, the so-called Cavalier poets, that came out of the Royalist cause. Some really, really fine work, I must say.
Is there poetry available today? Can I go and buy it on Amazon?
Oh, buy it. You don't have to buy it. You look up Cavalier poets, and it gives you a long list of them in Wikipedia, source of all truth. The best known, as he mentions, are Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, Thomas Carew, and Sir John Suckling. If you'll be patient, Richard Lovelace was imprisoned for his loyalty to the king in the Tower of London. And he wrote this poem in 1642 to his girlfriend, oddly enough named Althea. It's short, it's 4 stanzas, but it gives you a bit of the spirit of the Cavaliers. It goes like so. When love with unconfined wings hovers within my gates, and my divine Althea brings to whisper at the grates, when I lie tangled in her hair and fettered to her eye, the gods that wanton in the air know no such liberty. When flowing cups run swiftly round with no allaying Thames, our careless heads with roses bound, our hearts with loyal flames. When thirsty grief in wine we steep, when hells and draughts go free, they love to toast the king, you see. Fishes that tipple in the deep know no such liberty. When, like committed linnets, little songbirds, I with shriller throat shall sing the sweetness, mercy, majesty, and glories of my king. When I shall voice aloud how good he is, how great should be, enlarged winds that curl the flood know no such liberty. Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Minds innocent and quiet, take that for an hermitage. If I have freedom in my love and in my soul am free, angels alone that soar above enjoy such liberty.
Good stuff.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And one of their toasts, they would take a glass of wine, because at this point, Oliver Cromwell, who became the leader of the Puritans over time, he kind of pushed out everybody else. He would take a little piece of bread, drop it in the glass, and say, "God, send this Cromwell down." It's a pun. They like bad puns. Well, never mind. Anyway, so long and short of it was that in the face of the king, Cromwell emerged, and he formed what was called the New Model Army, which was made up of Puritan zealots who were very highly disciplined and ruthless. They were not really keen on prisoners.
Oh boy.
And he was a great one for massacres, was Noll. Not a nice person at all. And eventually, I won't go into details about all the politicking back and forth and all the campaigns, but suffice to say that eventually they captured King Charles. And in 1649, they had a mock trial for him at Westminster. And he was found guilty of treason. He was offered his life if he would consent to the abolition of the bishops in the Church of England. He refused.
Wow.
So he refused to give in on anything, and he refused even to acknowledge the existence of the court. You know, I'm the king. You can't do this. You can't try me. So they executed him.
Well, just pause for a second. When was the king captured exactly?
I was 1645, I believe, and there followed 4 years of politicking back and forth between the Puritans, the Scots, and so on. And when it became apparent that the king was not going to give in on anything, and that he was willing to die rather than change his views, they murdered him. And that was on January the 30th, 1649. It's interesting that of the, shall we say, great royal victims of the revolutions, Louis XVI was a direct descendant of Charles I, as were Blessed Emperor Karl and Zita themselves. And then Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra, were both descendants of Charles I's sister. So that's sort of an interesting, interesting factoid.
Yeah,
but
quite
at
ironic.
any rate, what's that?
That's quite ironic, I think, you know.
Yeah, well, the night before Louis XVI was murdered in his turn in 1793, January 21st, he asked for 2 books. One of them was a prayer book, but the other was the life of Charles I. And after the Civil War, Henriette Marie, the Queen, fled to France. And eventually, after some adventures, her son, Charles II, then James II, they made their way to France as well. And she was a French princess. The king was her brother, so she died there. But the great preacher Bossuet gave as they used to say, a panegyric, a eulogy, you might say, over her body at her funeral. And he spoke in great detail about the virtues of Charles I, and amongst other things, declared that in a certain sense, his was a sacrifice in reparation for what Henry VIII had done to the church. Which is hard reading, I can tell you. The thing was, of course, too, that when he died, there was almost immediately a cultus. People dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood because he was beheaded in front of the banqueting house in Whitehall. There's an equestrian statue of him near there in Trafalgar Square, which is a very beautiful statue. It was built before the Civil War. And the owner, the fellow who bought it, was supposed to melt it down into bullets, but instead he hid it. And then when the restoration came, they pulled it out of hiding and set it back up. So at any rate, thing was that Cromwell ruled for 10 years until 1659. He died. He had a son named Richard who wasn't very effective at governing. So the army, under one General Monk, decided the thing to do was to bring Charles II back to the throne. And that ushered in what was called the Restoration. And Charles X had a very difficult balancing act to pull. Because on the one hand, he's come back, all his supporters have come back from overseas, or they've emerged from wherever they hid. But the victors of the Civil War are still in power. They're still there. They still dominate Parliament. So he had to play a very careful game in pretending to be as supreme as his father ever was, while mindful of the demands and the insecurity of the oligarchs. So it was a tough road to hoe, and things became very difficult.
Oh no, I'm just saying that's got to be tough, because two passionate sides, you got to try to win them both over, appearing to do contradictory things.
You've got to try, and again, while pretending that you're still in complete control, even though you're not. And then, if that weren't difficult enough, his brother, who was the reorganizer of the Royal Navy, the Duke of York, he became Catholic with his wife, Anne Hyde. Now, they had two daughters, Mary and Anne, who stayed Protestant. But they became Catholic. Well, this became very, very, very difficult. Then Anne Hyde died. And James II, since his brother Charles had no heirs, no legitimate sons, James II, or he wasn't James II yet, but James, the Duke of York, would become Charles II's successor. So there was a big fight over this. And it was during the course of the fight over the succession that the two parties came about. The supporters of James becoming king were called Tories, after the robbers in Ireland. And his opponents were called Whigamores, after some Scottish Lowlands sheep stealers. So you see what became symbols of pride later started out as pure insults on both sides.
It's amazing how that happens.
Well, yeah. And Charles II died in 1685, and he converted to Catholicism on his deathbed.
He did? Is this confirmed?
Yeah, absolutely, okay. Positively.
Well, yeah, because there's a lot of deathbed conversions out there that I question. Like George Washington supposedly became. I'm really not sold on that.
Well, I'll tell you, it is. There are a lot of unexpected deathbed conversions, simply because, as Dr. Johnson put it so well, depend upon it, when a man's to be hanged in the morning, it focuses his mind wonderfully.
Yeah.
And having been to a few deathbeds myself, I can see it. Mind you, I've seen both conversions and I've seen shrieking despair. I prefer the conversions myself, but it's not for me to say. I can't judge for others. But suffice to say that the death of Charles II put James II in the hot, or James the Seventh of Scotland and Second of England and Ireland, really in the hot seat. For a few years, things went fairly well, and he issued a bill of tolerance, which was intended to remove some of the disabilities both from his people, the Catholics, and from the non-Anglican Protestants. The other interesting thing about James was that he was crowned king by the Archbishop of Canterbury with the Pope's permission. And of course, he was head of the Church of England and the Church of Scotland, likewise with the Pope's permission. And if that weren't bad enough, he was, until the current king, the last to be anointed with chrism that we would consider absolutely valid.
Wow.
So, and
But he was not Catholic, James.
Yes, he was.
James the Second?
Yes.
I thought his parents convert. No, I'm getting mixed up with someone else, maybe.
Not at all. His brother Charles II converted on his deathbed. He converted long before his brother did with his wife.
Okay.
But their two daughters, Anne and Mary, they stayed Protestant.
Okay, James II. Okay, all right. Just taking notes here.
No, not at all. So James, as I say, his first wife died, so he married again to an Italian princess. And the day they had an heir, you see, as long as he had no male heirs, and it would go first to Mary, who was married to William of Orange, and then to Anne, if they had no children, which in the end they didn't, and then to Anne, who was married to Frederick of Denmark, the succession would be Protestant. And as far as they were concerned, all would be well. But James married again and had a son. Also James, the Prince of Wales. Oh boy, indeed. And the result was that some of the wealthiest men in the realm invited William of Orange over for the first successful invasion of England since 1066, and the last today.
And ironically, both named William, you know.
Well, yeah, William the Conqueror and William the Anointed One. But so William came over. Unfortunately, there was a great deal of treason about. The Duke of Marlborough turned over the army on Salisbury Plain to William of Orange. So James and his family escaped to France. Their cause in Scotland was held up by the great Bonnie Dundee, the Viscount Dundee, who died in battle at the Battle of Killiecrankie. If you're a big Corys fan, you'll remember the song "The Field of Killiecrankie." That's the battle they're talking about. And then James went back to Dublin to try to hold on to his Irish crown. And that points up one of our great ironies of Catholic, Protestant, Irish, English history. Are you ready?
Yes.
Here it is. Because the Pope was having a conflict with Louis XIV of France at the time, and because James was his ally, the Pope was allied to William of Orange. And when he got the news of William's victory at the Battle of the Boyne, he sang the Te Deum in Rome. Isn't that nice?
Yeah, no, like I've heard something along that, but I didn't know all the details. I know the Pope was supporting William of Orange, but I didn't know that's because he was essentially going against a Gallican king, right? Who was allied with King James. That I didn't know. Oh, interesting.
So that's why the Pope was happy that William of Orange won, which should annoy both Ulster Scots and Irish Catholics very much. Annoyance is sometimes a good thing. The great thing about history is it doesn't allow anyone to be smug. Our side were always right. Maybe not.
No.
At any rate,
what Pope was this, by the way?
It was the one that succeeded Alexander VII, and I can't remember which one.
I'm sure it wouldn't be hard to look it up. You know,
yeah,
the Pope in 1689, right? That was Battle of the Boyne.
1690.
90, yeah.
And this whole adventure was called, I believe it was Alexander VII. Let me just double check. This whole adventure was called the Glorious Revolution. And no, what Alexander? Oh, it was Alexander VIII, I think. A mind is a terrible thing to have. All right. Yeah. Alexander VIII. That is he.
Okay.
Anyway, so the fun thing about all this is that Parliament, as a result of the bringing over of William of Orange, became completely supreme, totally sovereign. So, although their king that they brought over, William of Orange, and his queen Mary, went through all the ceremonies and the rituals that speak of royal supremacy, the Act of Settlement made them dependent on Parliament. And so it has been through Britain and the Commonwealth ever since. It didn't mean they didn't have any influence at the time. They had some, but they were not the ones in charge. So, the man who wrote the propaganda justifying the overthrow of King James, was a man I'm sure you've heard of, John Locke.
Oh, John Locke, yeah.
And that's how a lot of his writings were spent trying to justify the overthrow of King James.
What was John Locke a Puritan or an Anglican?
Neither. He was. By this time, you already had, as Puritanism was burning itself out, you already had sort of post-Christian people. I mean, I suppose he would have said he was Anglican, but he really wasn't much of a believer. I mean, he was in favor of religion insofar as it makes order. And he was against it insofar as it's enthusiastic. That is to say, really stands for anything.
Oh, okay. One of them. Okay.
Yeah, they're very common today. Well, now,
Yeah.
the thing was that James, having fled to France, he and his supporters did not give up without a fight. And his supporters were called, James being Jacobus in Latin, Jacobites. And this was the beginning of a long Jacobite adventure. He died in 1701. He's a servant of God, incidentally. James II is. His cause was introduced in the 18th century. It's never been closed. So you can pray to him. Same with Mary Queen of Scots, by the way, and Henry VI, just so you'll know. So you want to pray to Henry VI, Mary Queen of Scots, and James II, you go right ahead. But the how do I put it? The Jacobites continued after James died, first under his son James, who became de jure James III.
Was he Catholic too, or?
Yes, they would be Catholic from then on until the extinction of the dynasty. But William and Mary had no children, and so they died. And when William died, the throne went to his sister-in-law, the last Stuart on the throne, the last daughter of James, Queen Anne. Queen Anne's a very interesting lady for a number of reasons. One of them is that when they were going to make Catholicism in Maryland completely illegal, the Catholics of Maryland appealed to her, and she voided the bill.
Was she Catholic?
No, she was Anglican. But I think she felt guilty about the treatment of her father and her brother.
Okay. So
the Maryland Catholics called her ever after Good Queen Anne.
Oh.
And she also had a certain amount of power. You know, she although she was not the ultimate leader, she would chair cabinet meetings and things like that. And she had a great deal of interest in the day-to-day workings of the country. Now, she died. Had she died a little earlier, when the Tories were still in power, then the throne would have been offered to her brother. But the Whigs were in power. She died too late. So they invited, since the nearest heir was, of course, James, who was Catholic, and the Act of Settlement had forbidden Catholics to sit on the throne, they appealed to the nearest cousin, who was the Elector of Hanover, George I. He accepted the job of King of England, but he didn't speak any English.
Whoops.
Oops, indeed. So he stopped
Well, neither
sharing.
did neither did Richard the Lionheart. So I guess it's a bit of a
Well,
common.
the difference was that Richard the Lionheart had an army and actually could run the country, whereas George was dependent on quote unquote his government. And in fact, it is because of the inability both of him and then of his son George II to run cabinet meetings that the prime ministry developed the way it is now.
Hmm.
And the prime minister went from being the mere first lord of the treasury to being the effective head of the government, and thus, in reality, the head of the country. And that this is why, Queen Anne cast the last veto of any British sovereign ever.
What year was this?
1708.
Okay.
Also under her was the union of parliaments of England and Scotland, and the formation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain.
That was 1707, right?
Just so.
Yeah.
And so she was the first Queen of Great Britain, and the first under whom British was used, the term British. Well, exciting as all this was, the two Georges die, and in I should mention that when James was fairly old, his young son, Bonnie Prince Charlie, James, in 1715, the year after George came over, led a rebellion in England and Scotland, in 1715. That was defeated. His oldest son, Charles, Bonnie Prince Charlie, tried the same in 1745 and came very close to victory. Close, but no cigar. And so that was the last time the Jacobite movement really had a chance of changing the dynasty. So from that time on, instead of the traditional monarchy of Great Britain, which was like all the traditional monarchies of Europe, you had a figurehead monarchy, a king who nevertheless was not in charge, but acted as a non-political center of loyalty above party. Supposedly the guarantor of law and the Constitution. But of course, the problem with that is that the Act of Settlement made the prime minister and the party system the effective rulers of the realm. So that was a bit difficult.
That's what we have in Canada to this day.
Well, it is. And in fact, in Canada and Australia and so on, you've had kind of an interesting development. I'll bring the story forward a little bit. After Bonnie Prince Charlie died in 1788, but in 1760, George II's grandson, George III, became king. He was the very first of his family to speak English as his first language. And as he put it in his initial speech, I am the first of my house to glory in the name of Britain. And he was more interested in the British Isles than he was in Hanover. Well, he was kind of a revolutionary character in that, number one, he was in favor of Catholic emancipation, which was a very peculiar thing to be. In the successful outcome of the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War in Quebec, meant that New France came to him alongside the Indian Territory in the southern colonies. Well, he had a little bit of a problem in that the peace treaty obligated him to treat his new subjects as though they were his own born. Now, yeah, because you see, there were the penal laws, but he couldn't treat the French in Canada that way because of the treaty he signed. This is very, very, very difficult, as you might imagine, but the way out eventually was found, the Quebec Act, which gave my fathers our freedom, religion, and laws, and really was the first step in establishing the French Canadians as a real people. But he had other things in mind as well. Like Charles I, like James II, unlike them, he was bound, of course, by his oath to the law of settlement. So he really couldn't do anything without the permission of Parliament and the sitting government. Fortunately, by 1770, he was able to convince enough members of Parliament to do things the way he wanted them to be done. And so for 10 years, we had what was called the personal rule, because Lord North was the fellow he selected as prime minister. And he was pretty much able to get what George wanted done. But before that, for the 10 years of his rule before that, he had no control. And of course, after he didn't either. And he wanted to reform British governance in several ways. He wanted to assume an active role in the government the way Queen Anne had. Not King James, not King Charles, but Queen Anne.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted, as I say, he was interested in Catholic emancipation and was, in fact, the first king since James II either to visit or entertain Catholic nobility. He was very popular in Ireland, which was kind of an unusual thing for a British monarch. So much so that when the revolution broke out, the Irish Catholic Association offered to raise troops to put down the rebels. What was interesting about that, though, was that the whole idea was torpedoed by the Ulster Scots, who nevertheless would not be recruited themselves to fight in the Americas because so many Ulster Scots in America joined the revolution. So Ireland was kind of a dead wash in a lot of ways. But at any rate, George inherited several problems. One was, of course, that in the 7 Years' War, the British had put up millions of pounds in fighting the French and the Spanish and so on. And it was the British taxpayer that had to pay for that. So the question was, since so much money had been expended on behalf of the colonies, remember that every year they would send over a new army to defend the colonials against the French. And every year, except the last one, we'd smack it.
Oh.
Well, that's what happened. I can't help but say that we were much better soldiers than the Anglo-colonials. It's just the way it was. Matter of historical record, nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, just the way it was. But unfortunately, the defeat at the Plains of Abraham, in a way, paved the way for the coming revolution. There were several reasons for this. One was that each of the 13 colonies had their own little oligarchies, but they differed from colony to colony. So in the north, in New England, they tended to be Congregationalists, that is, Puritan merchants. In the south, they tended to be Anglican planters. Various British governments, up to and then including Lord North, had tried to come up with different schemes for getting the colonies to pay not their share of the debt or their ongoing defense, but a symbolic amount to show the British taxpayer that they weren't complete freeloaders, which of course we were, but never mind. Anyway, that led eventually to what I call our first Civil War, and what is usually called the American Revolution. It was a pretty hard-fought struggle. The British side was hampered by the fact that the Whigs at home worked against the king because they knew that if he won in the colonies, their monopoly of power at home would be next. And that didn't sit too well with them. So as a result,
I guess that would make sense, though. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, to give you an example of the kinds of things that were in the air, in 1773, the British East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, this was problematic because it meant if they did go bankrupt, the British government would have to start running India, which they would do eventually after the Sepoy Revolt of 1857. But at that juncture, they had the money and they were not interested in running India. So how do you save the East India Company? You don't tax their tea for sale in America. You see, this would have other benefits. A lot of people like John Hancock made their money selling cheap smuggled tea. But this tea would be cheaper than smuggled tea.
Than the black market tea. So I take it this is where the Boston Tea Party comes in.
Exactly. Precisely. That's exactly where the Boston Tea Party comes in. And you know, one of the funniest and most disingenuous things I've ever read about, I've ever heard about, I should say. They used to have a film at Lexington, the Lexington Battle Site Visitor Center in Massachusetts. It was supposedly came out in the bicentennial of '76. It was supposedly the colonists arguing. And one of them says, "So what? This British tea will save us," and he actually gave the exact amount per pound. Who cares? We want freedom. Well, yeah, okay. The real problem was that it would have broken people like John Hancock, who was one of the 4 wealthiest men of the colonies at the time. The others being George Washington, Charles Carrollton, and Philip Schuyler, all famous revolutionaries. Because, as with most revolutions, the American Revolution was won from the top, from the people who already had most of the power. The proof of the pudding is that those Americans who rallied to the king, apart from those who were office holders who felt they couldn't break their oaths and so on, they tended to be from cultural and religious minorities and from neglected geographical areas, shall we say. Because each colony, as I've already mentioned, had its own oligarchy, its own setup. And those who felt out of the loop had no desire to join in a great crusade for the sake of that oligarchy. Easy to understand. So anyway,
that seems like, since that conflict is brewing out of the monarchy versus the aristocracy, that probably explains why they did things like tar and feather people and expelled them, and
the whole thing.
Some nasty stuff. You know, it goes back to Cromwell, right?
It goes back to Cromwell. And this is why that the English Civil War, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, are so important, because they determined ultimately not just British, but American, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand history. And they're why we don't really have a coherent conservatism in the English-speaking world, and especially not in America. Because the principles of the revolution are ingrained: the glorious for you and the American for us. And it's interesting, if you read Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, apart from his attack on the Quebec Act, which is Orwellian, that aside, what you see is that he's stealing all of the arguments directly from John Locke. And it's interesting too that William Cobbett, he wrote a book called The Catholic Reformation in England and Ireland.
That's a good book, by the way.
It's a tremendous book, but he makes the point that the American Revolution came directly from the so-called Glorious Revolution. And there's another point to be made, and that is that the arguments for the one with the arguments for the other. And in truth, the reason why Jefferson attacks the king instead of Parliament and the ministry, who actually made the laws and decided what would happen, is because if he did, he would be destroying his own argument for the Congress. That's why he had to attack the king. And if you can imagine,
he was like double dipping, I guess.
He was like which? I'm sorry.
He was double dipping in terms of ideologies.
Well, yeah. I mean, Jefferson was very, very elastic. You know, many years later, when he was the leader of the opposition in our first federal government, he was what was called a strict constructionalist, which meant that he would allow to the federal government only what the Constitution gave him. Then he became president, and he was all over the map in terms of usurping powers. This was pointed out to him. He said, well, I wasn't president then, which is true. Can't argue with that. Anyway, the funny thing as far as the conduct of the revolution goes is that Sir William Howe, who was the British general sent over to deal with it initially, he was a Whig himself, and 3 times he let Washington's army escape. And when he went back to England after he retired, he had to face a parliamentary board of inquiry to find out why he had done this. And his response was beautiful. He said, the answer to that question is political, and I choose not to give it.
Ooh. Oh,
Can't argue with that either. Nope, no argument there. So the end result finally was that he, in 1778, due to some sort of mischief on the part of Howe and Clinton, his subordinate, General Burgoyne was defeated, and France and then Spain came into the war. Well, at that point, it was impossible for the British to win, but it did turn George III against Catholic emancipation. And the irony is that he had just put through the first Catholic Emancipation Bill of 1778. But from the time that France and Spain, as he felt, betrayed him by joining his rebels, he had no use for Catholic emancipation any longer.
He knew that, yeah, that makes sense, you know.
Yeah. So when the war was over, we had 100,000 Americans who had to say bye-bye to their native land. And a lot of them went to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, the eastern townships of Quebec, and of course, Ontario, all of which Ontario and the Maritimes really came into their own because of the Loyalist immigration. But there were 2 other countries that got Loyalists as a result and became what they are now, sort of, the Bahamas and Sierra Leone in Africa. A lot of Black Loyalists went there. So the Constitution, of course, would eventually be written after a few years of chaos. And the interesting thing there was that the presidency was modeled on the way the founding fathers thought the monarchy worked. But not exactly. At any rate, Eric Nelson, who wrote a book I highly recommend called The Royalist Revolution, he ends his account of the war by saying on one side of the water, there would be a monarchy without a king, and on the other, a king without a monarchy. Because, of course, the defeat in the revolution destroyed George III's attempts at reforming the British Constitution and began the long process of divvying up British governance into the effective and the ceremonial. So, which we never went through in the United States. So in Britain, you've got the king, the prime minister, House of Lords, House of Commons, the Lord Lieutenant and the High Sheriff of the county, the chairman of the county council, the mayor, the provost, Lord Mayor, Lord Provost, chairman of the city council. This goes all the way down to the bottom. But in the States, in certain ways, we're much more like old British governance than they are in Britain. In most of our states, the sheriff is still a very important figure with all the powers of his medieval predecessor. And if you remember the phrase, the posse, you may remember it from old Westerns and so on. We got to get us a posse together.
Yeah.
Well, that's posse comitatus, the power of the county. And the power of the sheriff to pull people together and go after somebody is enshrined in medieval English law. And it came over to the United States and became a big part of our Western films.
Ah, what Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. There's a posse in that one.
just like that. And the interesting thing is that the sheriff of Los Angeles County is about as powerful an individual as the medieval sheriff of Nottingham. Whereas, of course, the current sheriff of Nottingham is a member of the city council and has, pretty robes to wear, but that's about it.
Ceremonial robes, yeah.
Yeah, just so. The other thing that would eventually come out of the revolution, it's very important for Canada. One of the things that was first mooted was the idea that the king should administer each colony directly with its parliament, leaving Britain out of the loop. And that was simply unthinkable at the time. But as what we call the divisible crown, with the Statute of Westminster in 1931, it became the law of the lands, plural, which is why King Charles, although he's King of Britain, as King of Canada, he's a separate person. Totally. That's why the Governor General is appointed on the advice of Mr. Trudeau instead of the advice of the British Prime Minister, which was the case in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true in each of your Commonwealth realms.
Oh, I didn't know that. So that's all because of the Statute of Westminster?
Yeah, because prior to that time, the Governor General represented the King or the Queen nominally, but in reality represented the British government. But what happened then was with the Statute of Westminster was that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland, which was a separate dominion in those days.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And no confederation. That's an old Newfie song from 1949. But the Irish Free State, they each became separate, independent, and equal partners in the Commonwealth, which is why, for instance, when Edward VIII abdicated, each of his Dominion governments and parliaments had to accept his abdication. De Valera forgot to, which is why legally it never took place in Ireland.
Well, but he supported the Free State. Was he the Free Stater?
Who, Edward VIII?
No,
De Valera.
No, Delaware. Yeah.
No, De Valera was dead set against the Free State. That was why Michael Collins was killed. They had a civil war in 1920. 22. Michael Collins negotiated a treaty between the British and Ireland, and it made the Irish Free State a dominion like Canada, soon to be more than independent, shall we say, but with the 6 counties staying part of the United Kingdom, but under the Home Rule Act of 1914. So they'd be running their own show. This did not meet with the approval of a lot of people who wanted an independent republic encompassing all 32 counties. Now, how they were going to do that without the Ulster Scots getting unbent, is anybody's guess. But nevertheless, that was the idea. So they signed the treaty, but De Valera and what became the Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin refused to accept it. So they had a bloody civil war from 22 to 24, during the course of which Michael Collins was murdered.
Yeah, I've seen the movie. I've seen the movie Michael Collins, so that kind of explains everything. Yeah, he did. Like, is his assassination like how it actually happened? Like he was going in between towns and.
No.
Okay.
No, in fact, interestingly enough, I was in Ireland about a month ago. We were driving along and we suddenly blundered into the death site of Michael Collins.
Ooh.
I didn't even know we were anywhere near it. I had no idea where it was. I hadn't thought of it, but there it was. There was the statue. And, a lot of Collinses in that neck of the woods. You see them all the way down to Skibbereen. But I was very, very touched by that. It was quite something. At any rate, one of the funny things as far as De Valera goes as I mentioned, in 1936, Edward VIII abdicated. Well, De Valera was Taoiseach by then. And so, first thing he did was he got rid of he passed a whole bunch of bills, one of which abolished the governor generalship, another one of which declared that George VI was the person responsible, not the king, but the person responsible for Irish foreign affairs. Now, the problem was, as I say, he didn't bother to accept Edward VIII's abdication. But nevertheless, nobody picked up on it. So George VI was considered the king for their purposes. Well, as you know, World War II comes along. Great Britain declares war on Germany and is followed fairly quickly by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Ireland remains neutral. But here's the fun part. As King of Ireland, as King of Great Britain and the rest of it, George VI was at war with the Axis. As King of Ireland, he was neutral. And all through the war, he continued to sign the letters of accreditation for Irish ambassadors to the Axis powers. And in turn, they were accredited to him as King of Ireland.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's so interesting. Kind of use a backdoor method on paper. He's only known as the King of Ireland. Oh, that is so cool.
As far as the Axis were concerned.
The Axis,
so,
yeah.
And then in 1949, they voided Taoiseach Costello voided the Exterior Relations Act, and that's seen as the date whereby Ireland became a republic. But as you can see, it's all very strange legally. The thing is, the reason why I mention all this is because the idea of the divisible crown is the basis on which Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, etc. Nationhood rests today. Because, as I say, Charles III is King of Canada, is a separate man from Charles III as King of Australia, King of Great Britain, etc. In Canada, he answers only to the Canadian government. But mind you, they have the same relationship with him that the British government has with him. In other words, Trudeau's ability to do anything he feels like doing comes from 1688 and ultimately from the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. You might say that little Justin and the prime ministers of Australia and New Zealand and the rest of them are sitting in Cromwell's chair.
That's interesting. So how this whole thing that Cromwell, I guess, so it's very clear how Cromwell flows into what we have today. I think you've shown that, but like you talked about the War of the Roses, how there was no ideology there. It was like Catholic monarchists versus Catholic monarchists. They were fighting over who would own the throne, right? That's all they disagreed on. There was no ideology. And so Henry VIII, when he split with Rome and he looted the monasteries, he created an aristocracy, a rich aristocracy. And did that eventually become the Parliament?
Yeah. Well, they became, I mean, Parliament already existed as an institution.
Yeah, it did.
But they came to dominate it.
Okay.
They came to dominate it. The sad truth of the matter is that from that beginning, you have what we have now. You know, Benjamin Ling makes the point. He says, this concept that Charles is king of the UK is different from the Charles king of Canada is farcical. Well, it's what we call legal fiction, which is what governments generally run on. In my country, we pretend the people rule. But then he follows the comment with none of this stuff makes sense anymore. Well, that's also true. The fact that the king has to accept whomever the prime minister proposes as governor general is it's problematic because even in the way the books describe it, right? They say, all right, the Governor General's main job is to act as a sort of guarantor of the Constitution, so that if ever a government get out of hand, they can be the voice of legality. And then you have historic examples of that: Australia in 1975, Canada in 1926, and so forth. But it's very difficult to do that if the Governor General is appointed by the Prime Minister via the King. I mean, you're basically in a position of having the foxes guard the hen house. And I, personally, again, I'd have to say you have to lay the blame at 1688 and 1642. One of the interesting things about your current king, now I've read an awful lot of what he's written and followed very carefully what he's been doing for the last 30 years as Prince of Wales.
Mm-hmm.
And when people complain about this or that aspect of him to me, I say, well, you're right, especially if you want to compare him to somebody like St. Edward the Confessor or James II. But if you want to compare him to anything I myself have been allowed to vote for, any weasel that appears on the ballot, he's a lot better, actually. And the thing is that with him, and I don't know what it means, I don't know if it means anything, but it's suggestive. They kept saying that he would take the name George VII because Charles was too Stuart, too Catholic. And of course, the other Charles III was Bonnie Prince Charlie. And that was what we were told. He'll never take the name Charles III. When a play/movie came out a few years ago called Charles III, which has a great scene in it, by the way, where he dissolves Parliament. Oh, if only. But that was what was said. And yet he turned around and he took the name Charles III. So the coronation comes. He does a couple of interesting things. As you know, Pope Francis gave him some pieces of the True Cross.
Yep.
What does he have done with those? He turns them into a processional cross, which is made part of the regalia, part of the crown jewels. Now, there are several sets of crown jewels scattered around Europe, including here in Vienna, that have processional crosses with pieces of the True Cross in them. But England never had one, to my knowledge. And now it does, which is sort of interesting. It's a modern play on the medieval trope, if you will. And the other interesting thing was that he required the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem to co-consecrate the chrism he would be anointed with. So he is the first British king since 1685 to be anointed with chrism that we Catholics would consider indisputably valid.
Really?
Yep.
That is fascinating. So
he's an interesting guy.
Consecration as king is 100% valid. Interesting.
Well, his anointing as king. I mean, remember that's the most important part of the coronation ceremony. The crowning is important symbolically, but it's the anointing. And again, I'm talking about Catholic theology now. Don't ask me what Anglicans believe. But it was the anointing that was really the sacramental center, that of the oath taking. It was really the sacramental center of the ceremony. And they were very similar. I mean, the ceremony that he went through was very similar in terms of text and everything to what Blessed Charles of Austria had when he was crowned King of Hungary, or Louis XVI, or any Catholic monarch in days gone by.
Okay.
So what that's going to mean, if anything, I couldn't tell you. I know personally, not being a lover of either 1642 or 1688, I wish he'd dissolve all his parliaments and dismiss all his prime ministers.
Ooh. Yeah, no, that would be that would be interesting. So then what role did the parliament play in the 1200s? Because I think the French had the Estates General, that's like their parliament, since the 1300s. So I mean,
Precisely.
Parliaments do go back to medieval Europe.
Absolutely.
What was their role then? Just raising funds, or?
Well, yes. Well, partly that was the biggest thing, raising funds and also bringing up concerns. I mean, again, let's look back at what the estates were, and they had them in every realm. They varied according to details. So, like for instance, in France, you had 3 estates, which were the church, the nobility, and the commons. In Sweden, you had 4: the church, the nobility, the city dwellers, and the country landowners. So you see, it details would vary, but it was the same idea. And it was a play also on St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle's ideas on the best form of government. They each held that there are 3 good governments, and they have 3 sort of evil imitations, as you might say. So monarchy, despotism; aristocracy, oligarchy; and what they called polity, which was ruled by the majority of stakeholders, landowners, veterans, etc. In other words, people who contributed to the body politic, versus democracy, which was ruled by the mob. And then they both said the best kind of government partakes of all 3 of the good kinds of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and polity. And so the estates and the king and the estates were seen as reflecting this ideal setup. To answer your question, what did they do? Well, most kings, most European monarchs, supported their governance out of their own funds, their own estates. What they call in Britain today the Crown Estate, what in Canada they call the Crown Lands. These are all survivals of that idea. So the entirety of governance would be carried on normally by the king spending his own money. But what if there's an invasion? What if there's a famine? What if there's a disease? In other words, what to do if you need more money? Well, you call together the great folk of the realm and you ask them for it.
This is interesting. This is interesting because I've got over there, I won't get it, but the book by St. Robert Bellarmine on the Roman Pontiff that Ryan Grant, who I assume you know, has graciously translated. God bless him. I've had him on my channel as well. But in that book, he talks about like the church being a monarchy, but he kind of talks about the monarchy in actual life, how there's 3 forms of government, essentially: a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy. The monarchy, the best one, is a monarchy with bits of pieces of the other 2 in there. So not a pure monarchy, not an absolute monarchy, but a monarchy, with the parliament and a bit of people involved, so everyone's involved. And it's
well, one of the ironies to me. Sorry.
No, continue.
No, I was going to say one of the ironies to me is that today, we speak of absolute monarchies. The truth is, no monarchy has ever been absolute in comparison to the governance we have now.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And I think it's important to take these conversations into the real world, where we live. Louis XIV, even the horrible Henry VIII, did not have the control over their subjects that our current masters do. And so my little joke, if it's a joke, is that we've done something that St. Robert Bellarmine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Aristotle never thought of doing. They said the best form of government was a combination of the 3 good ones. What we've managed to do is combine tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
They never theorized about bringing all 3 bad governments together and making them truly absolute. Think of little Justin invoking the Defense of the Realm Act against the truck drivers.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
I'll tell you what. And it was no better south of the border, let me tell you. I was here in Austria, of course, where our chancellor was saying "Impfen macht frei," which means vaccination makes free. Not really a smart phrase to use in Central Europe.
No.
And that's simply because you look at the democratically elected rulership in all of our countries, they're all morons. And I mean this in a nice way. Almost all. There are a few exceptions. But most of them, they've got absolute power, and they're very stupid. And by stupid, just to be clear, I mean, by stupidity, I mean the marriage of ignorance and arrogance. They don't know how things work, but they don't care because they don't need to know.
They don't care because it works for them in exerting their power.
Yeah. So, like Cromwell, if you don't like it, tough.
Wow.
And I mean, one of the things that I've speculated on is, my last book was about Blessed Emperor Charles. Writing about Zeta now, what they represented with Louis XVI, with Charles I, what a lot of these guys represented, was a sort of sacrificial leadership. That a willingness to die for your people that is simply alien to us today. I mean, could you imagine Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden willingly going to their deaths for their country?
Nope. Not in a million years.
No.
Not in a million years. And I think it's absolutely fascinating what you said. The thing that has throttled me of this whole it's all throttled me, but the thing that stood out to me the most is you said not long before they executed Louis XVI, he asked for his prayer book and the biography of Charles I, because that just shows how basically 150 years later in a separate country, those two events was connected. The details are a bit different, but overall it's the same thing.
Overall, it's the same thing. And it was the same with Nicholas II. It was the same with Blessed Emperor Karl. The great crisis of our time in church and state and everywhere else is lack of leadership.
Oh yeah.
We wanted to be free from minority rule. Well, we're certainly free, but not from minority rule. Just a different minority, and not a very good one. I see we're getting toward the 2-hour mark, but if you'll humor me, there is, believe it or not, another poem specifically about Charles I that I think is worthwhile.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of a Catholic poet named Lionel Johnson?
I've heard the name. I couldn't tell you anything about him.
Late 19th, early 20th century. He was a convert of the pre-Chesterton and Belloc era, although he knew Yeats and people like that.
Okay.
But he wrote a poem called "By the Statue of King Charles at Charing Cross." The equestrian statue that I mentioned that's near Whitehall is there now and was there in his time. And he wrote this poem about it, which not only is it very beautiful, it's very, I think, evocative of the whole struggle, you might say, from the time of King Charles and the Cavaliers to the Jacobites down to our own time. Here it is. By the Statue of King Charles at Charing Cross, Lionel Johnson. Somber and rich the skies, great glooms and starry plains. Gently the night wind sighs, else a vast silence reigns. The splendid silence clings around me, and around the saddest of all kings, crowned and again discrowned. Comely and calm he rides, hard by his own Whitehall. Only the night wind glides, no crowds, no rebels brawl. Gone to his court, and yet the stars his courtiers are, stars in their stations set, and every wandering star. Alone he rides, alone, the fair and fatal king. Dark night is all his own, that strange and solemn thing. Which are more full of fate, the stars or those sad eyes? Which are more still and great, those brows or the dark skies? Although his whole heart yearned in passionate tragedy, never was face so stern with sweet austerity. Vanquished in life, his death by beauty made amends. The passing of his breath won his defeated ends. Brief life and hapless? Nay. Through death his life grew sublime. Speak after sentence? Yea, and to the end of time. Armored he rides, his head bare to the stars of doom. He triumphs now, the dead, beholding London's gloom. Our wearier spirit faints, vexed in the world's employ. His souls are the saints, and art to him was joy. King, tried in fires of woe, men hunger for thy grace, and through the night I go, loving thy mournful face. Yet, when the city sleeps, when all the cries are still, the stars in heavenly deeps work out a perfect will.
Wow. Pretty powerful. There's some good, there's so much good stuff hidden in there that like most people just overlook, but like just hearing your explanation of all this, it all comes to life. You know, this all makes, it makes so much more sense to me now. Because like me, like I read a lot of history, I read primary sources and stuff, but like my history is kind of like Charlemagne up to 1300, although I've dabbled in the 100 Years' War. But no, like this explains how we got to things today, and maybe yeah. What was, just a quick question of the War of the Three Kingdoms, also known as the English Civil War? What was the most important of the battles?
Well, that's a very difficult one to answer, but I would say probably Marston Moor in 1644, which basically lost the North to the king.
Oh, yeah, because you said the North and the West were the pro monarchy
They were
area.
senators. And the king's capital for a very long time, although he set up the banner at Nottingham, was Oxford. And Oxford, it's they call it the mother of lost causes. And if you go there today, Christ Church College is where he set up his court, and reigned from Oxford until he was forced out by the changing patterns of the war. And if you think about it, during the Middle Ages, Oxford was the center of Franciscan scholarship. People like Roger Bacon and Robert Grosseteste. After the Protestant Revolt, it was the center of recusancy, of Catholic resistance. It was for the king during the wars. It was very Cavalier, and then it was very Jacobite. And then those traditions would surface again in various strange ways in the Oxford movement.
Yeah, yeah. Oh,
And the rise of Anglo-Catholicism, which in the end would give birth to the ordinariates that we have today. And then lastly, but not leastly, that also influenced some of the Inklings, Tolkien, Lewis, and Williams, and their buddies that were all hanging out in Oxford in the 40s and 50s.
Wow. So Oxford has always been very pro-Catholic.
To a degree, in a sense, in a way.
Yeah. Or certainly more Catholic than a lot of other places in England.
More than Cambridge.
I'm curious. I picked up this book. Have you heard of this book?
No, Providence Lost, the Rise and Fall of Cromwell's Protectorate. No, I don't know it.
Yeah, because like I saw this published. It was recommended by Ryan Grant. You know Ryan Grant, right?
I know, and I take his recommendation.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Do you have any books to recommend? I know you recommended The Cousins War by Kevin Phillips. I jotted that down. But have you got any other ones that you could recommend before you go? I know you got to run here.
Yeah, believe it or not, I'd recommend some novels by a 50s and 60s novelist called Jane Lane.
Jane or James?
Jane, Jane, Jane. Jane Lane. Specifically for this period, London Goes to Heaven.
London Goes to Heaven. I like novels. I make sure that every fifth book I read is a novel, or else I won't read novels. But
That's a sound idea. I know what you mean.
yeah, no, I'm currently reading actually an English author. Since we're talking about it, I'm reading the James Bond novels now,
Oh,
which are
okay.
fantastic, by the way. So much better than the movies.
Having lived most of my life in Los Angeles, that's downright un-American, pal. Oh, uh, uh,
I'm Canadian, though. Remember?
I knew that. Although, let's face it, there
And
was
don't
a
get me wrong, I
while.
like the movies. I like the movies, but the books are better.
They are actually. Vancouver, though, just remember, there was a while when it was bidding fair to become the great rival to Hollywood.
Well, they still do a lot of filming in Vancouver, and Vancouver Film School is, it has international students in it.
I love the old joke about Vancouver that it's part of the United States, so the people are so smart they don't pay taxes to Washington.
Ooh, yeah.
You know what is funny though? When you go to the prairie provinces, if you're American, I mean, Eastern Canada, not just Quebec, but Ontario and the Maritimes, they are really foreign. I mean, if you're an American, they seem like a foreign country. But Western Canada,
Okay.
but Western Canada seems much, much more American, except that you'll see crowns everywhere and royal this and royal that. And it's like a weird parallel world where the revolution didn't take place.
Well, it's kind of interesting because the province I'm in, Alberta, is kind of like a continuation of Montana. Like
Yeah,
if there were not a sovereign border there, you would not think you're crossing into anything. Same in Saskatchewan, the prairie province next door, a continuation of North Dakota.
yeah.
In Manitoba, they actually have the same accent as Minnesota in the south of Manitoba. It doesn't make it up to Winnipeg, the big city in the province, but it's in the south there. So we have that accent too.
See, there is some cultural overlap, and it hasn't escaped me. That there's in the northeastern corner of Maine, there's a little Danish colony. Oh, no, sorry, a little Swedish colony, New Sweden. Not too far away over the border in New Brunswick is a little Denmark.
Really,
I don't know if there's any relationship between the two, but it's a strange parallel.
I've been to New Brunswick, but that was probably 20 years ago. I don't think I've been to Eastern Canada apart from like changing flights in Toronto for
Um,
20 years.
I've spent a good deal of time in Ontario and Quebec. I've never been to the Maritimes, sadly. I've always wanted to go. New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, PEI,
They're okay.
especially. Hmm?
They're okay places, yeah.
Well, PEI was funny. My multiple great grandfather, Lachlan McKinnon, who fought at Culloden, he and his wife came to PEI in 1772. The thing was, there was a Scottish laird by the name of MacDonald of Allendale, who, seeing that a number of the Catholics in the Highlands, their landlords were trying to force them to convert to Protestantism, he decided to create a refuge for them. And Glen Allendale, it's called Glen Allendale, MacDonald Glen Allendale. So he he got this big brig, Alexander it was called, and about half of the places were made up by Scots Highlanders in this position. But he could only fill up about half, so the rest were from the islands. They were Catholic, but they weren't threatened. They just saw a chance at improvement. Well, the deal he gave them was that they'd be indentured for 7 years, and then afterwards they would get something like 50 acres of PEI. Well, that was great until the Alexander arrived in PEI, and they saw what 50 acres would be, and suddenly they didn't like the idea, not at all. So the Laird said, "Well, I'll tell you what, you can buy me out of your indenture for 50 quid a piece," which in those days was a ton of money. So a lot of them said thanks, but no thanks, and did a bunk. Most of them went to Cape Breton, but my multiple great grandfather and his wife, they went to Quebec, where I already had an uncle living in Matane on the Gaspé. Now you know what my whole Scots Canadian history right there.
Oh, interesting. I got one more quick question. I just thought of it right now, actually. You said like in the Cromwell Civil War, what you have is the Puritans against like Catholics and Anglicans supporting the monarchy. And you said by the late 1600s, at the time of John Locke, you kind of get post-Christian stuff. And and since this is all tangentially tied to the French Revolution, the revolutionaries in France have thrown off faith completely. They didn't have any faith at all.
Yeah.
And so I guess that was like the only difference in that 150 year era. Protestantism essentially burnt itself out for all intents and purposes.
And yes, and of course, one of the big differences is that in Catholic countries, the revolutionaries in Catholic countries have nevertheless been formed by Catholic faith and Catholic culture. So they're great believers in absolutes. They're not people for compromise, which is why their revolutions are so bloody and why they threw out so much. But in Protestant countries, they're much more adept at maintaining the forms of things while emptying it out of meaning. So that's why in Britain and in Canada, and Scandinavia, North Germany, the Netherlands, so many old, beautiful forms are maintained, but the meaning is gone. I always think of the changing of the guard in Ottawa on Parliament Hill.
I've seen that. Yeah,
it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. I don't want to get rid of it. But if you just listened and looked, you would think that King Charles III was the absolute sovereign of his Dominion of Canada.
Interesting. I saw that in 2000. I think it was 2001. It was the summer before 9/11 happened. Like we went on a huge vacation, and that's the only time I've ever been to Ottawa. We spent about a week there. My family vacation. My parents, my sister, and I. Yeah, no, that's really the only time I've been. I try to avoid Eastern Canada just because of their politics are so awful.
So crazy. Well, sorry.
Well, they're starting to move out west too, and they're bringing their voting patterns here. Like they're starting to move out west for the prosperity, or more prosperity anyway. And they bring their bad voting habits here, and like we're starting to. It's kind of like what's happened with Texas. Everyone's leaving California for Texas. It's turning Texas from a red state to a purple state.
Yeah. And what people, they terraform these things. It's pretty. But I'm just looking. You remember last year, 2 years ago now, when the Queen died, and they had all over the Commonwealth the accession proclamations. Do you remember this?
No. I mean, like a whole bunch of stuff happened when the Queen died. It was a huge deal.
Well, in each capital, the lieutenant governor, except in Ottawa, as the chief herald, would read out an accession proclamation. And bearing in mind how many of these guys many of these politicians are atheists, how many are Republicans, these proclamations were kind of funny. I mean, here's one for you, which is from Newfoundland. This is by Her Honor the Honorable Judy M. Foote, Lieutenant Governor of the Province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Whereas it hath pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown of Canada and all other her late Majesty's realms is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Prince Charles Philip Arthur George. Now know ye that Her Excellency the Right Honorable Mary Simon, Governor General of Canada, assisted by His Majesty's Privy Council for Canada, has hereby with one voice and consent of tongue and heart published and proclaimed that the high and mighty Prince Charles Philip Arthur George is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our lawful and rightful sovereign, Charles III, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom, Canada, his other realms and territories, King, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, supreme Lord in and over Canada, to whom we do acknowledge all faith and obedience with humble affection, beseeching God, by whom all kings and queens do reign, to bless the royal Prince Charles with long and happy years to reign over us. By Your Honor's command, God save the King.
Wow. Boy, if only our politicians acted like that, like actually the stuff centuries ago that was made by people that actually believed in that stuff, it's just
Exactly.
kind of a remnant. In Nova Scotia, until about 2007, 2008, on Sunday, everything was closed. Everything was closed on Sunday, except like the hospital. Obviously, you can't close that, but like everything was closed. But they abolished that law, and now it's just like any other day. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I can think of a lot of things I'd like to abolish. Salaries for elected officials come to mind.
They didn't always have that.
What's that?
Did they not always have that?
What, salaries? Oh, no, gosh, no. Once upon a time, the people who served in office had money. And so you didn't pay them. They already had money.
Wow.
And the idea was that if you wanted to make it egalitarian so that anybody could serve, give them good salaries. So we have an old joke, in Washington, D.C. You may not be a millionaire when you enter the Senate, but you sure will be when you leave.
Oh.
I like to say that, ultimately democracy is the best government money can buy.
The best government money can buy, yeah. And the best propaganda money can buy too,
And the best justice money can buy. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because I don't judge being a Californian.
Oh, yes. Charles, I know you got to run, but I got to say this was absolutely fantastic. I learned so much. There's so much here, and like it's a very eventful episode. It shapes shapes the world we live in today. All the bad and the odd good. We won't deny that, but certainly all the bad.
Well, God does bring good out of evil on the one hand, and on the other, someone said to me some years ago, and the older I get, somehow the truer it seems, it really isn't a question of right or left, or conservative or liberal, especially in the
Yep.
English-speaking world. It's always Cavalier and Roundhead.
Cavalier and Roundhead.
Yeah. In other words, on the one hand, you always have the killjoys who, the sanctimonious killjoys, who, will keep the Sabbath and anything else they can get their hands on. And on the other hand, you've got the sort of devil-may-care, fun-loving defenders of the old order who, when they lose, usually lose big, but they go down fighting and laughing.
Fighting and laughing.
And there's a certain amount of truth to that, I think. At any rate, I just hope that better times are coming. Whenever I address young people, I always like to tease them and say, it's easy to look at the world today and say, oh, the boomer generation left us a ton of garbage to deal with. And I say, I don't want you to look at it like that. I want you to look at it in terms that, well, we've left you a series of character-building challenges to overcome. I like that a lot. I think that sounds much better than we screwed everything up.
There was a novel I read back in the day where the main character, he's like a very thoughtful guy. He's always like, think of the solution, not the problem. And I think what you said is essentially that, just tying it in with our problems. This book was a fantasy book, so it's a make-believe realm. But
nevertheless, fantasy often sheds a lot of light onto reality. And the truth is that you're only defeated when you admit you're defeated. And ultimately, the only real defeat is not to go to heaven.
Yeah, that is a defeat.
And the thing to bear in mind, I mean, if you go to hell, then no victory you've ever had is going to do you any good. And if you go to heaven, then any defeat you've ever suffered has been part of your way there.
Speaking of which, you mentioned Charles II became Catholic on his deathbed, and that's verified. Did Charles I ever become Catholic?
Well, there's an interesting thing. It's his defenders, especially in organizations like the Society of King Charles the Martyr, will point out that he did not see a division between Catholicism and Anglicanism the way we do. He said he died a member of the Church of England the way he'd received it from his father. But he was of the opinion, as we know from numerous things he wrote, that the Church of England was simply the Catholic Church of England. What that means in reality, I don't know. We'll have to wait to see, be on the other side. But one thing I can tell you, and he wrote this to Gregory the 15th, and I think it'll give his opinion better than I could, frankly. He wrote, let me see. Yeah, let me see. Hold on, I've got to get a good, clear version of it. He's writing to Gregory the 15th and about the question of the unions. And in April 30th, 1620, he wrote the following. Let me see. Here we go. In a letter of April 20th, 1623, he wrote to Pope Gregory the 15th, quote, "Never did they, his ancestors, carry the standard of Christ's cross against his most violent enemies with a more cheerful spirit than I will use and endeavor. the peace and unity of the Christian commonwealth, which hath been so long banished, may be brought back, returning as it were from captivity or the grave. For since the subtlety and malice of the father of discords hath sown the seeds of such unhappy differences among those who profess the Christian religion, this measure I deem most necessary. Wherefore, by your holiness, be persuaded that I am and ever shall be of such moderation as to keep aloof as far as possible from every undertaking which may testify any hatred towards the Roman Catholic religion. Nay, rather I will seize all opportunities by a gentle and generous mode of conduct to remove all sinister suspicions entirely, so that, as we all confess one undivided Trinity and one Christ crucified, we may be banded together unanimously into one faith. That I may accomplish this, I will reckon as trifling all my labors and vigilance, and even the hazards of kingdom and life itself.
Wow. Wow. What a man. I didn't know this. I didn't know all
You're not supposed to. You're not supposed to. Remember, stupid is good. Ignorant is blissful. It allows your masters to own you happily.
That's like freedom is slavery. It's like 1984, right?
Precisely right.
Yeah.
And as we get reminded by one meme after another, somebody needs to tell those in charge that 1984 was a cautionary tale and not a how-to book.
Not a manual, yeah.
No.
But no one reads that book anymore, and that book is published in the 1940s. No one reads it anymore, you know. I've read it, you know, I like a lot of Orwell stuff, but
I hate to say this, but we had it in school when I was in school.
Yeah, so did my dad, actually. Like, he read it in school, and like it's a good book to read, but and I think if you want, you can read Animal Farm. That's kind of like same principles, but a much shorter, condensed book you can read in one sitting.
I always like the end of it where no one could tell the difference between the pigs and the farmers.
Yeah, the 2 legs, no, 4 legs good, 2 legs better. You know, it was 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Kind of becomes 4 legs good, 2 legs better. You know.
Yeah, and all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others.
Yeah.
That's, you know.
Yeah, no, those 2 books everyone should read just to see, like, and you know, absorb the information and see the sleight of hand that our rulers are inflicting on us.
Remember that dystopia is better than datopia.
I've never heard that. That's a good one. That's a good one.
Well, neither have I. It's here and now. I may use it again tonight.
Oh,
dystopia is better than datopia.
All right. You want to wrap things up here?
Yeah, I guess we should.
If you got any final words to my listeners and viewers?
I do indeed. The Jacobites had a toast, which was, they had a lot of them, but this is a particular one. Remember that they were illegal, and that advocating for the rightful Stuart king was punishable by death and heavy fines. So they had various coded toasts, and the Stuart king in exile was called by his enemies the Pretender. So here it is. God bless the king, I mean the faith's defender. God bless, no harm in blessing, the Pretender. But who be that Pretender, and who that king? God bless us all is quite another thing.
Wow. I'm going to use that one. Man, I've learned so much. All right. Well, I will kill the stream now. Thank you, everyone who tuned into this. This was a great show. And yeah, I'm killing the stream right now. Everyone have a good Saturday, and God bless.